All right, so we're gonna get started, please. Some of you are eating, some of you may not be eating yet, but we have plenty of food, as you can see, so please eat. My name is Michael Rodriguez Muñiz. I'm Associate Professor Sociology, and I'm this year's, I guess, curator for the program for Institute for Governmental Studies, Race, Ethnicity, and Immigration speaker series. Really excited for the panels we've been able to have thus far, and that we're going to have our discussions that we're going to have in the weeks to come. Thank you for coming to our second installment of this semester's talks. Just to give a heads up, we have one more session before the end of the semester on November 19th. Historian Monica Jimenez will be presenting on her new book, Making Never Neverland, Race and Law and the Creation of Puerto Rico. We're watching contemporary, current political discussions post the MAGA Trump Madison Square Garden event. Puerto Rico's in the news, among other things. But this is a really significant new book that looks at race and law. And I imagine we'll touch on some of these topics of how Puerto Rico has fit in the U.S. Political and racial imaginary. Today we have the fortune to have with us Professor Diane Wong, who's traveled cross-country and also made time during her sabbatical to come and share some of her important work with us. Dr. Wong is Assistant Professor of Political Science at Rutgers, Newark. She's also an affiliate faculty member with Global Urban Studies, American Studies, and Women and Gender Studies. Her research and teaching interests include American politics, race, ethnicity, critical urban studies, comparative immigration, gender and sexuality, cultural media studies, and community-rooted research. Her current book project, You Can't Evict the Movement, Intergenerational Activism and Housing Justice in New York City, focuses on intergenerational resistance to gentrification in Manhattan's Chinatown. Today's talk, I believe, will be part of sharing about that book project. In addition, Professor Wong is also working on another book titled Asian America Rising, Movement, Moments, and New Visions for the 21st Century, and it presents a series of contemporary case studies that represent the diversity of Asian American political activism, community building, mutual aid, and issue-based organizing. You can also find, while you're waiting for these two books to drop, Professor Wong has various articles that have appeared in a wide range of academic journals, from PS Political Science and Politics, Urban Affairs Review, Women's Studies Quarterly, Amerasia Journal, also was co-editor for an issue of Frontiers. And another thing that was on your bio is that in addition to being an accomplished scholar, Professor Wong is also an artist and has a couple exhibitions at Pace University and a storefront for ideas in New York City. If you go to our webpage, you can click on links that'll show you a bit about those exhibitions. So with no further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Wong to Berkeley.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that introduction, and to the Institute for welcoming me. I was telling Kathy that this is a really wonderful break from the lectures related stuff. So my talk stems from this larger book project of mine, which sits at the intersections of housing justice, abolition, and contemporary Asian American activism. And so in the intro, just an overview of the book. In the intro, I introduced interstitial politics as sort of a framework for thinking about how we understand the realm between clandestine and formal expressions of politics. And so what I call interstitial politics, as seen in the title, is inspired by the Black radical tradition and feminist studies scholars who have articulated that our politics encompasses more than what is apparent to the eye, and that our academic theorizing and our methodological choices must also include activities that fall below the radar. In chapter 2, living in the shadows of racial capitalism, I contextualize how the gentrification we see today in Chinatown is not newly spontaneous, but must be understood within lengthier temporalities of settler colonial violence and Asian racialization, right? I'll cover chapters 3 and 4. So 3, the eviction machine, tenant organizing and growing the grassroots. And chapter 4, Mott Street, shop talk, and everyday sites of queer resistance in the talk today. So I'm not going to go into too much detail right now. In chapter 5, art washing, cultural gaslighting, and the politics of placekeeping, I follow the cultural organizing work of the Chinatown Art Brigade and situate the brigade within a longer lineage of Asian American cultural organizing in New York through past collectives like the Basement Workshop, Yellow Pearl, and Godzilla Asian American Arts Network. And here I consider the radical possibilities of socially engaged artists in shaping alternative futures and in combating the effects of art washing, or the ways in which artists are instrumentalized by the real estate developers to raise property values and displace working class tenants. In chapter 6, Chinatown's United Against Displacement, I talk about the connections between the gentrification that we see in New York's Chinatown to other Chinatowns across North America through the newly formed Coast to Coast network. And I draw from interviews conducted with Asian migrant massage workers and sex workers and mutual aid collectives in Seattle, Vancouver, and LA to uncover the creative ways in which Asian Americans across the country are building towards abolitionist visions for housing justice. So this is like the one slide of text that you might see. This whole time I'm trying to keep everything more visual. And I'll draw from my community collaborations in New York's Chinatown for over the past decade or so. And so in the first half of the talk, I'll focus on chapter 3 and sort of the impacts of financialization and predatory equity on the lives of tenants in Chinatown, and the role of grassroots orgs like the Chinatown Tenants Union in developing the power of working class tenants. I'll share the story of how tenants at 90 Elizabeth Street took their predatory landlord to housing court in a joint action lawsuit, and sort of what it means to organize within the interstices of the law with an eye towards abolition. In the second half of the talk, which focuses on chapter 4, I'll speak about how Asian American women, queer, non-binary, and trans youth in Chinatown are making connections between displacement, carcerality, and abolition by building a more inclusive and intergenerational movement for housing justice. There's a lot to cover, and I'll do the best I can with time for a conversation. All right. So the first time I met the 90 Elizabeth Street tenants was 7 years ago, when I was working with CAB organizing Asian communities and their Chinatown Tenants Union. Twice each week, I went door knocking in buildings around the neighborhood to see if tenants had heat, water, and basic repairs. During my first encounter with 90 Elizabeth Street, I observed the insides of a building that had been so utterly uncared for. Most of the apartments lacked working smoke detectors, layers of dust covered the stairwells, electrical wiring was exposed in the hallways, and blue plastic sheets covered each apartment door as if no one had lived there anymore. Their landlord, James Fong, bought 90 Elizabeth Street for $6.5 million in 2015 from Marolder Properties for $3 million over its purchase price. Marolder Properties had purchased this building in 2013 from the Winslow Association, which had owned this building since 1987. This practice, known as predatory equity, is a form of real estate speculation where buildings are purchased for a much higher price than rental incomes can support. Right? Predatory exacerbates housing precarity because there's an incentive for landlords to evict and convert affordable housing units into market rate for profit. In the last decade, the Asian population in Chinatown dropped 15%, while the percentage of white residents had increased by nearly 20%. And so there are many tactics that landlords are using to evict tenants in Chinatown, from everyday things like turning off the heat, gas, and water, right, to using construction harassment, litigation intimidation, and the installation of new surveillance technology. This is one of the tenants who, this is sort of the bedroom area that David showed me. For Betty, a 44-year-old resident of 90 Elizabeth Street, her living condition had deteriorated to the point of no return. She told me, "In my apartment, there's a toilet in my living room because James tore it out of my bathroom. There's a hole under the kitchen sink with pipes exposed and the main drain pipe is disconnected. In order to cook, I carry water from the bathroom sink where there's a drainage problem and a huge crack in the ceiling which looks like it'll collapse at any moment. The toilet has been in my living room since July. The workmen said that they'll finish repairs all the while trying to get me to accept a lowball buyout offer. No one should live with a torn up kitchen, toilet in the living room, and collapsing ceilings in every room. David, whose apartment I showed earlier, another tenant, spoke on behalf of his mother, Maria, who was sick with a chronic respiratory illness at the time. He said, "For 10 years, my bathroom did not have enough water pressure for us to take showers. We would take sponge baths instead. The apartment is so cold sometimes we have to sleep in our jackets." According to city records, the 90 Elizabeth Street building had 69 open housing violations, including 51 classified by the Department of Buildings as immediately hazardous. In a single year, the tenants had made over 200 311 calls to the city, lodging complaints ranging from the landlord doing hazardous construction work without permits to having no heat in the wintertime. With the support of CAB, Organizing Asian Communities, and their Chinatown Tenants Union, the tenants at 90 Elizabeth Street came together to form a tenants association. Right. In 1986, so this was an image of CAB in the founding, but I'm not sure why it won't show up. But CAB was founded by 2 Asian American women in Chinatown, and it was in response to anti-Asian violence that was happening across the country, including the murder of Vincent Chin in 1982. The organization later broadened their political organizing to focus on a wider range of systemic issues, including militarism, police violence, worker exploitation, and gentrification. CAB has had a long history of combating racialized violence in all its forms, from supporting taxi cab drivers, Asian migrant workers, nail salon workers, street vendors, and garment workers. In the 1990s, CAB was the first organization to advocate for the rights of immigrant street vendors in Chinatown who were being unfairly targeted by under Mayor Giuliani's quality of life crackdowns. In 2005, CAB formally established the Chinatown Tenants Union, which is a group that has since been at the forefront in the fight against evictions and predatory landlords in New York City. CTU was founded by 2 Chinese immigrant women, Mrs. Liang and Ms. Zhang, and has since helped create over a dozen tenant associations in Chinatown and have played a crucial role in helping tenants solve immediate housing concerns and also shifting power away from landlords through securing historic rent freezes, right to counsel, among other things. In 2018, the 90 Elizabeth Street tenants decided to take their landlord, James Fong, to housing court through a joint HP case. So while HP actions are meant to be a straightforward course for tenants to sue their landlords, the process has become drowned in bureaucracy and large amounts of paperwork. This paperwork can include things like lease and renewal leases, rent receipts, utility bills, letters that are sent to the landlord, written records of housing conditions, photograph of apartment conditions, receipt for repairs made as needed, complaints to 311 logging complaints, logs of days without heat, hot water, etc. After 3 court dates in which 2 resulted in adjournment, a settlement was reached outside of housing court between 90 Elizabeth Street tenants and their landlord. The tenants eventually got their landlord to fix all open building violations and provide 2 years of abatement, right? Meaning that they don't have to pay rent for 2 years. But despite this historic victory, this outcome felt anticlimactic, right? Because many of the tenants were exhausted and knew that this victory would only be temporary. And this ambivalence really compels us to confront what we in the academy might too often define as success in a racial capitalist system, when in reality resolve seems to be elusive and always out of reach, right? Everywhere, but nowhere at once. Even with legal representation, Betty recalled the bureaucratic chaos of this experience even when language interpreters were present at the courthouse this entire time. She expressed, "The fact that you have to mobilize everyone across the language spectrum takes time, and it creates a headache. Trying to communicate was a process because there were always 4 translations going on at the same time: Cantonese, Mandarin, Spanish, and English. We had to make sure that we were on the same page as a group, but that James Fong also understood our demands. Even though the city requires language interpreters to be available for non-English speaking litigants, there are often inconsistencies with compliance of language access requirements across courthouses and not enough interpreters for the number of cases that are settled outside of the courtroom, which actually makes up the vast majority of cases, right? After cases are settled, there's also usually no enforcement mechanism to ensure that landlords are held accountable for their actions and for their repairs. And so given the limitations of litigation, groups like CTU continue to play a critical role in leveraging this systematic imbalance that is the housing court by offering things like interpretation and using tactics that delay eviction and that create clogs in the system until more radical visions of housing justice can emerge. The practice of documentation became an important strategy for the 90 Elizabeth Street tenants to organize against their landlord. So for New York City residents, 311 offers a quick way to report problems and non-emergency service requests. The hotline was established in 2003 as sort of a centralized municipal government platform. And the majority of service call requests have included things like complaints about building violations and noise. Once a call is made, HPD collects the service request from tenants, and in buildings where 311 complaints accrue, the city will send an inspector who then issues a violation and requires the landlord to pay a fine, to correct the violation, or to show up in housing court. Housing advocacy groups like CAB, CTU have used 311 as an organizing tool, training tenants how to submit their complaints to the city so that each violation is kept on record without fear of retaliation. So during one monthly CTU meeting, Betty shared with other Chinese tenants how she had been using 311 record group to record grievances against her landlord. She explained, "When he moved our mailboxes to the post office because of hallway construction, I complained to 311 because it was inconvenient for me to walk 20 minutes just to get mail. I also called 311 about temperature changes. Every day I kept a log of the temperature inside my apartment. It was different every day. One day it was an ice box, and the next day it was a sauna. When the landlord took me to housing court 3 months ago, I used these records to support my case. We have to call 311 to record what happens because otherwise it's like it never happened." So in this way, record keeping becomes a vital process for tenants to make visible what is often unseen, by validating their often isolating experiences of abuse that's carried out by their landlords. And for the 90 Elizabeth Street tenants, the everyday act of calling 311 supported their case and was itself an act of refusal in record keeping and in survivance. Given that the most egregious forms of landlord harassment, housing violations occur behind closed doors, the anonymity behind calling 311 enables the tenants to lodge complaints against their landlord in order to get violations on record and also to have their experiences validated. So I've written about this in the past as part of an open access project called Methodologies for Housing Justice Guide in collaboration with the folks at UCLA. And so by manipulating city data in a way that supports tenant placement, these oppositional tactics, like record keeping through 311, transforms the state apparatus into a tool of mass resistance. And in the sense, documentation is not only about record keeping in the present tense, in the past tense, but also about shaping the future and what lies ahead. Right? 2 months after the coronavirus pandemic put New York City into lockdown, the 90 Elizabeth Street tenants went on rent strike after the landlord installed CCTV cameras in their hallways, which is not uncommon. In a letter the tenants wrote to their landlord, they collectively expressed, Many of us have lived in this building since we immigrated here. This is our home. We are in the midst of an unprecedented public health crisis that has caused countless to lose their incomes. We are among millions of New Yorkers who find themselves in this position. We are simply unable to pay rent in addition to all other necessities that face us, and so are commencing a rent strike. The tenants joined nearly 15,000 renters across the state in the largest rent strike in a century amid the global health crisis. More than ever, the pandemic has revealed the absence of social safety provisions that tenants have access to and the need for alternative paths forward. Right, in Oakland, in Kansas City, Los Angeles, and elsewhere, we've seen tenants across the country build countervailing power against financialized landlords through mutual aid efforts, landlord watch parties, legal defense funds, grocery and rent drops, cancel rent caravans, emergency care, and coalitional alignments that get us closer to more transformative changes to beyond what the state can offer. As practical and visionary abolitionist reforms, or what some might refer to as non-reformist reforms, reduce the power of landlords, financial institutions, real estate developers, and the vast ecosystem that upholds racial capitalist dispossession while building up the people at the grassroots. They challenge us to think about deeper solutions that do not unintentionally re-legitimize or expand the scope, power, and authority of the state by allocating more resources to police, courts, corrections, prosecutors, and judges. They require us to meditate on unsettled resolutions and that we resist the impulse of prescriptive answers, right? To move beyond the reactive rhythms of urgency and towards sustaining the infrastructures, institutions, and relationships for long-term organizing and movement building. We've seen examples of this through the defund movement after the murders of George Floyd, about Aubrey Breonna Taylor at the hands of the police, through efforts to abolish student debt led by the Debt Collective, cops off campus across UC and CSU campuses, and more recently, Stop Cop City in Atlanta. The same is true for what's happening in Chinatown, where we're seeing the emergence of a new iteration of Asian American abolitionist organizing that challenges us to theorize a kind of housing politics that is not only reactive to existing systems of power, but is fugitive and visionary in the sense that they're forging new scales and new figurations of resistance that bring us closer to different and better worlds. So in the early years of the pandemic, the topic of anti-Asian violence was propelled into national dialogue, particularly in the aftermath of the Atlanta spa shootings, which left 6 Chinese and Korean massage women, migrant worker women killed. Since then, we've seen the co-optation of Asian American identity under the illusion of progressive inclusion, right? For instance, the Stop Asian Hate campaign, which began as a hashtag, is now a state-centric funded project by industrialized nonprofits like the Asian American Foundation, which has called for the expansion of police power. In New York City, responses to anti-Asian violence have led to hate crimes legislation and the reliance on carceral logics as evidenced by the formation of the NYPD Hate Crimes Task Force. To be sure, state investments and carceral infrastructures work in tandem with state neglect and the ongoing collapse of social safety nets, including the tethering of resources for migrants, for mothers, for children, for tenants, and for those who are poor, unsheltered, and sick in favor of prosecution and arrest. Right? Displacement is one of the most persistent forms of violence that Asian immigrant communities continue to face in the US, and the issue of housing serves as a focal point of intersection with all other aspects of society. So in this half of the talk, I'm going to shift gears a little to talk about the borough-based jail plan in New York City and how Asian women, queer, trans, and non-binary youth in Chinatown are building towards sort of an abolitionist vision for housing justice and ideas of community safety. Is anyone familiar with the borough-based jail plan or has heard of it? Okay. So the borough-based jail plan is an expansion of the carceral state in New York City, which has deep roots in Chinatown. This is an image of the Tombs, which is also known as the Manhattan Detention Complex. And it was built in 1838 in an area that became the heart of Chinatown. In 1982, the Koch administration expanded the tombs to include a 9-story north tower to house pretrial detainees or those who have yet to be sentenced, right? This expansion led to the eviction of tenants who were mostly Chinese seniors and small businesses, each receiving $250 to relocate. In one of the largest rallies in Chinatown history, 12,000 protesters took to the streets in opposition of this expansion, arguing that jails not only adversely impact those who are detained, but have a detrimental impact on the local ecosystems in which they are constructed. As intertwined processes, displacement and mass incarceration are both driven by settler colonial forms of dispossession that violently removes indigenous, Black, and working class communities from land and bolsters the power of real estate developers, landlords, financial institutions, corporations, policymakers, criminal courts, and the police. Despite community protests, Koch dismissed these mobilizations with his now infamous words, "You don't vote, you don't count," and went ahead to construct the North Tower. Fast forward to 2017, Mayor de Blasio approved an $8.3 billion borough-based jail plan. Presented under the guise of closing Rikers, the plan involved the construction of essentially 4 new jails in every borough except for Staten Island. The site for the Manhattan jail would essentially replace the tombs in Chinatown. In partnership with architect firms, urban planners, and criminal justice reform nonprofits like the Barra Institute, the city has promoted the plan to be a more efficient, supportive, and humane alternative to Rikers, right? The plan has been pitched to residents as a mixed-use development with commercial and retail storefronts on the ground floor. And as artist Tamia Arai recalls, when they held the first community outreach sessions, the architect printed these designs. The exterior of the jail having a beautiful dragon sculpture. And there was supposed to be a gallery on the first floor. They were selling it as a cultural center. Once constructed, the Chinatown jail would become the tallest jail in the world. In winter of 2018, in response, groups like Black and Pink New York City, Critical Resistance, Desi's Rising Up and Moving, the Audre Lorde Project, and others came together to form what eventually became the No New Jails New York City Coalition. The citywide coalition included 2 collectives from Chinatown, the Chinatown Art Brigade and the WOW Project. So in what follows, I'm going to introduce the work of the WOW Project and their efforts to cultivate non-carceral approaches to community safety and wellness. This is Diane Wong Co., which is located at 26 Mott Street. Anyone familiar with the storefront or has been there? Nice. Okay, Eric, I know you. So inside the storefront is the WOW Project, which is a women, queer, trans, non-binary, and youth-led initiative founded in 2016. The store was on the brink of closing until Mei Long decided to take over as the 5th generation shopkeeper in 2015. So better than I can explain, I want to show just a short clip of how I first met Mei. And this is on YouTube, so I'm just gonna cross my fingers and hope it works. Can people online see this or no? Okay. You're sharing your screen. No?
It's muted right now.
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
All right.
Wingawa is the oldest shop in Chinatown, 91 years old this year. It's been in my family for 5 generations. So started with my great-great-grandfather who came to America as a merchant.
He opened it in the 1890s, and it was originally across the street, where it was more of a general store. I think they also had like medicine. You could go there for like postal service, but then he moved it across the street to a bigger space in the 1920s, which is where we are today.
back in the day when mother-in-law took over in mid-60s when her dad passed on. So she had a crisis at that time.
She wanted to focus on one object, and she found that person was her calling, and that's how it's been ever since.
And for the past 50 years, my father-in-law and mother-in-law carried this business along and passed it on to us. This picture of all of us gathering here and having meals and going through our routines and opening the store 7 days a week was a picture that all of us have in our minds when we venture beyond the boundaries of Chinatown and the store.
Leaving Chinatown for college and then leaving to go work and live abroad for 3 years, that courage that I had to leave home was rooted in my strong base here in Chinatown and with my family.
She could rely on that memory in her ventures beyond Chinatown. And it brings comfort, safety, and security, and it's predictable.
Me, myself, and like my sister and my other cousins all have full-time jobs, and this was when I think May was still abroad or had just come back. So none of our paths were to take on the store.
Mother-in-law and father-in-law are getting up in age. They're 93 and 87. It got to a point where they were getting too old to carry it on.
When I found out that my grandma and my parents were considering selling the building and giving up the business, it was really upsetting to me, and I didn't want to be so reactive. I wanted to understand where the decision was coming from.
My grandma, I think, didn't want us to be trapped by the store. She saw it as a negative thing at the time.
My family, I think they didn't really know what to do in the time that we were going through the motions of putting our building on the market, talking to a bidder, and almost signing. They all were kind of frozen. We're like, okay, it's happening. We can't do anything about it.
She was in a fork in the road. She was accepted to grad school. We were on the cusp of selling the business. So there's a lot of conflict and struggle with that.
I was only one jumping up and down, waving my arms no, this doesn't have to be something that just happens. And in the end, I didn't want it to be a decision that we regretted. And because we all live in the community, it's it would be so painful to walk past the storefront and see something else here instead of our space. At the same time, I had met a woman named Diane Wong. She walked into the shop in December of last year and was starting her dissertation research on the gentrification of Chinatowns in the US. And so after she met me and had my interview, she invited me on other interviews with her. She said, I know that you're reintegrating back into Chinatown, and maybe it'll be a good idea for you to come along with me. So that moment of meeting her and then spending 3 months interviewing different community stakeholders was a turning point for me, because I was able to listen to the stories of the people that make up my community, listen to the issues and the concerns.
Although, small businesses start in small worlds like Chinatown, neighborhoods like this. How do you sustain it is that, you continue for as long as you cannot, and if there's an opportunity for those to return like me, you offer them that option, and if that's not their wish, you move on. That's basically the way of the world. Because for mom and pops to start a business in New York City, a gentrified New York City is very difficult. Expenses are very high. You don't have much money, and it's great risk.
One point that comes.
So I'm gonna pause the video here. It's this is only half of it, but the rest is on YouTube. This video was made by Wow Project member Denise Zhou. It was screened at the Tribeca Film Festival, and so it's a really well-made video that I encourage folks to check out. I got it. And so guided by, oh no, why is it moving on its own? Okay. So thinking about queer feminist understandings of power, of embodiment, and care, the shop has since transformed into a space of intergenerational dialogue and grassroots action to combat displacement. And so in a span of 8 years, the WILD Project has curated a series of free public programs, established a storefront artist in residency program, and launched an intergenerational archiving project called Bridging Futures. 5 years ago, May created Resist, Recycle, Regenerate, which is a year-long fellowship program that brings neighborhood youth together to engage with histories of Asian American activism through the traditional practice of papermaking. And so during the annual Lunar New Year celebrations, the fellows would gather large bags of discarded confetti shreds and recycle the confetti shreds back into the community by transforming the confetti shreds into paper pulp and then into handmade confetti paper. The confetti paper is then used for DIY zine making workshops with community residents that pulls from past issues of Bridge magazine, which is an Asian American activist magazine from the 70s, which have since been donated by former members. And so in the book, I talk about how this program crucially tends to sort of the uneven ways in which women, girls, and queer youth experience and contest the loss of their homes, bodies, livelihoods, and spaces, and how a new generation of youth as part of the RR program are envisioning alternative futures for themselves and also for their communities. Before the pandemic, I worked with May to launch Chinatown Movement, a series of events that focus on labor, housing, and LGBTQ justice, and included panel conversations, film screenings, bilingual walking tours, and it culminated in an open mic. So this was from our panel on the 1982 garment workers strike, which brought together former garment workers, organizers, and union reps together to share memories of the strike and also to learn lessons of how they mass mobilized the largest strike and protest in Chinatown history. In the blue is Ms. Ka, who was a garment worker at the time and one of the lead factory organizers. This was from our housing justice event that brought together 3 generations of Chinatown tenant union organizers, including 2 of the founders, Ms. Zhang and Ms. Liang. We launched a first ever queer Chinatown history walking tour, which drew from critical mapping methods as inspired by the anti-eviction mapping project to uplift sites in the neighborhood that hold significance to queer and trans liberation as erased by gentrification. Most recently, we partnered with Powell Art Center in Boston Chinatown to curate an exhibit and a series called Homeward Bound, Global Intimacies and Converging Chinatowns, where I had the chance to tell my own family histories with displacement. As plans to build the jail in Chinatown continues to unfold, the WILD Project launched a series of free public programs called Cartographies of the Present, Charting Our Freedom Dreams, aimed at unsettling the relationship between arts, social movements, and cultural expansion. So the first program was the launch of a zine called The Jail, the Police, and the People's Chinatown, created by Serena Yang, who was a former Resist, Recycle, Regenerate fellow. The second event was a teach-in, which presented an opportunity to collectively study the trajectory of prisons and punishments in New York City. Why was Rikers built? Why do reformers want to close it now? How are the deaths of Khaled Browder and Yang Song interconnected? And how do we care for each other before it becomes too late, right? By addressing these questions and tracing different histories and stories of the jail from the 18th century to the present, the event provided a conversation to connect the continuing legacies of slavery and settler colonialism to the fight against this new jail in Chinatown. The final event was held at Collect Pond and led by memory worker Cal Mays. The park, which used to be a body of fresh water, became a portal to grieve the interlaced layers of ecocide and genocide that have led to the repeated construction, demolition, and resurrection of the tombs, and to a portal to imagine ways in which we can repair a relationship to land. Earlier this year, the WILD Project held a People's Abolition Parade at the proposed jail site. With Critical Resistance, Nadudal, Asians for Palestine, The Illuminator, and Q-Wave and other groups in the city, the jail became a site of joyous protest and experimentation through poetry readings, musical performances, and outdoor projections in the spirit of the transnational legacies of Asian American feminist movement building, which has always sought to theorize and practice radical possibilities as alternative to empire, militarism, capitalism, and state violence. At one point during the People's Abolition Parade, the WOW Project handed out seed balls, which were created the day before and filled with native wildflower pollinator seeds, which were hurled over the fence of the construction site, which had already broken ground at the time. So using the metaphor of indigenous seed keeping, in which ancient seeds are preserved until germination conditions are met, Serena Yang explained, just because demolition is underway does not mean the jail is a foregone conclusion. We are seeding revolt and revolution. Last month, the WOW Project, along with the Chinatown Art Brigade, launched the Borough-Based Jail Liberation Project. So the Borough-Based Jail Liberation Project is a riff off of the Borough-Based Jail Community Liaison Office. This is the actual office storefront for the new Chinatown Jail. Located right around the corner from the construction site, the Borough-Based Jail Liberation Project turned the former storefront into a centralized hub for dreaming concepts, ideas, tactics, actions, and practices for what abolition could and already looks like in Chinatown. For an entire month, the Borough-Based Liberation Project invited study sessions inspired by the intergenerational classrooms, which were active in Chinatown in the 70s and 80s when collectives like I Work Quinn and Basement Workshop provided both a physical and intellectual space for residents to engage with local issues. The conversations held in the storefront varied from the aestheticization of penal reform to bilingual discussions of kinship beyond the familial and fraternal, right? Towards the entrance of the storefront was a prompt that asked, in place of a jail, what could be here for our community instead? The responses varied from the tallest public library in the world to a free health clinic, and one person simply wrote a home. And so I want to close out the talk by sharing some photographs of an exhibit that I recently curated, which were held in the same storefront. The storefront is owned by Chongpak, a nonprofit that provides affordable housing for Chinatown seniors. The exhibit, titled Archivist Memorial, draws from interviews and digital artifacts from the APA Voices, a COVID-19 public memory project. APA Voices is a volunteer team of cultural organizers, oral historians, archivists, educators, caregivers, and activists who came together in March of 2020 to document how the pandemic has been impacting Asian Pacific American communities. The exhibit was one of many forms the APA Voices project has taken in the last 3 years, from a series of virtual programs to a public syllabus and improvised writing to annotated interviews and listening sessions to a published article in the Journal of Asian American Studies. In refusing the capitalist imperative to simply return to normal, the exhibit offered an alternative interpretation of the archive as an embodied activist practice that deepens community connectedness. The exhibit featured oral histories and artifacts that were donated by various groups, including the Asian American Feminist Collective, Red Canary Song, the Auntie Suing Squad, Freedom Inc., Khmer Girls in Action, and others. Red Canary Song's installation honors the Asian migrant women who were murdered in the Atlanta spa shootings and the lives of massage parlor and sex workers. The Asian American Feminist Collective curated an abolition bookshelf for the back wall of the storefront that touches the new jail construction site. So these are resources for the community. The Chinatown Tenants Union donated posters that tenants used for rent strikes during the pandemic. And the WOW Project donated a banner that was created for a community procession and memorial after the murder of Christina Yuna Lee. When the exhibit was up, there were several other mass shootings that had taken place. So the front window became a makeshift memorial for the victims of Half Moon Bay and Monterey Park. The windows featured a compilation of notes that visitors left, giving voice to collective grief. Right, one person wrote, "We protect each other," and someone else simply wrote and crossed out the word guns. One visitor told me that she wasn't even sure she needed the physical space to mourn until she stepped into the storefront and wrote a note to post on the window. And that action was cathartic for her, right? A reminder how we need spaces to grieve and to collect our grief. How grief too is a daily practice of abolition. The exhibit led to the publication of, so this is just a photo of the special issues, but it led to the publication of an Asian American abolition feminism double special issue in Frontiers, a journal of women's studies that I co-edited with the collaborator Rachel Kuo. And the special issues feature sort of a constellation of scholarly inquiry, right? Movement artifacts, creative works, scholarly pieces that orient us towards capacious ways to get free. I know the text is really small here, but this, I just pulled this from online, and everything's accessible on the journal's website. And so these collaborations have really been defined by sort of a dialectical method of building and experimenting with abolitionist practice alongside and within community. And so we're actually celebrating the launch of these two special issues at the American Studies Conference in Baltimore next month. So if anyone's gonna be there, stop by at Red Emma, a local bookshop in Baltimore. I think I'm gonna end here just because I do wanna leave time for conversation. So thanks you all.
Any comments, questions?
Thank you so much for coming in the amazing presentation. Sounds like you've been thinking a lot about like politics emerging in Chinatowns like across the country. But I'm actually curious about conversations between in particular Chinatown Tenants Union and like the other organizing groups and the other Chinatowns within New York City, like Flushing or Sunset Park. It seems like the research was like hyper-localized, and I'm wondering if they are doing any like cross-borough organizing, particularly in response to the borough-based jail plan.
Yeah, so I mean, this is still unfolding as we speak, right? These sites have broken ground, but it's definitely not right a foregone conclusion. And so the No New Jails coalition is no longer right in place just because of various tensions. But the WOW Project, along with the Chinatown Art Brigade, has been working with organizations in Queens and Brooklyn and the Bronx, where the other jail sites are located, and thinking about how to scale up right local fights. It's been difficult partially because of geography, right? It's just it's hard to get anywhere in the city, one. And so that has been one of the limiting factors in the kind of borough-based jail organizing. But to your question on whether or not, there's organizing connections between New York's Chinatown and Flushing Chinatown, Sunset Park, and the other communities, there hasn't really been that much intersection with the Flushing community. There is with Sunset Park. There's a lot of anti-displacement work there. But more recently, there's sort of the emergence of cross-collaborative work with Flushing, where the city, along with developers, are trying to build like a giant casino right in the neighborhood. So connecting the predatory practices of landlords and developers to the city and to casinos is sort of what I see as the next step for this kind of cross-community organizing. Thanks for the question, though.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. I really loved the kind of the two halves of the talk, focus on housing organizing against predatory landlords and organizing around abolition. And you kind of started to get at this in your answer to Julian's question, but could you maybe speak a little bit more about how you see the interconnections between these forms of organizing, other than it seems like the same community and often the same people are involved in those struggles, but like, how do you see them as one struggle?
Yeah, that's
Or do you?
that's sort of one of the tensions, right, in the book as I'm writing it. And I think one of the pieces that I've been really struggling with, because, you know, the connections are not apparent, right, for obvious reasons. And I think one of the nodes of connection is the kind of surveillance technologies that we are seeing being used with jails, with the police, and that we're seeing extending into the sphere of people's private homes, right? In a lot of the Chinatown tenement buildings that are owned by financialized landlords. There's been a push and a drive to install new forms of landlord surveillance technologies that are directly connected to the kinds that the NYP uses, right? And I think what's difficult about making those connections is that, one, there's a language piece, right? Wherein when you're working with non-English speaking tenants, right, I think building that kind of vocabulary has been kind of a challenge, but also in connecting, you know, the private sphere to what is happening in ways that might not seem so apparent in tenants' daily lives, right? Those interactions with police and the visceral forms that Black and Brown communities in New York City might face. So the connections are there. I think I'm still trying to sort of more explicitly draw out those in the book. And I'm really glad that you asked that to challenge me to sort of really locate that.
Do you think there might be something too about all of the resources that get kind of like gobbled up by the carceral state its apparatus, and like the possibility of freeing up some of those resources to better support like housing justice and things like that? Do you think that's a potential connection?
Yeah, so I think, you know, with the Chinatown community, right, there's definitely, right, when we're thinking about a reallocation of resources, I think a lot of people, especially elders, are really excited to thinking about the many different alternatives that can take place if we're not funding, right, a $100 billion NYPD force and building and spending $15 billion on building new jails, right? But I think there's still the when it comes to thinking about carceral logics, I think it's really easy, especially for some of the youth organizers in the Law Project, Chinatown Art Brigade, to think about the system, but not the ways in which carceral logics are internalized and in our bodies, right, in our hearts, right? So thinking intergenerationally, there's still a lot of anti-Blackness within Asian immigrant communities, especially within Chinatown. And so there was an attempt to build a homeless shelter, right, in Chinatown a few years ago. And a lot of the elders who came out said they don't want a shelter here because of safety reasons, right? So I think there still needs to be a lot of conversation when it comes to what alternatives can exist in a way that is more liberatory and not NIMBY, right? Yeah.
I was wondering if another connection between housing advocacy and abolitionism might be rooted in this younger generation that you highlighted and where they grew up. And maybe I guess my question is, to what extent did being in these spaces that were that required advocacy and resistance around like losing your home or living in a really rundown apartment because of a horrible landlord, to what extent did that possibly socialize the youth who grew up there in these places to realize the power of organizing to bring change? And then that bleeds out into, well, what are some of the other issues that we might organize around? Like, did you hear in the stories that were shared with you examples of youth that grew up in these buildings that encountered the tenants' rights movement, were part of it, their parents were part of it, maybe that was part of their political socialization, and then that launched them into these other forms of activism?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it's sort of an interesting mix of youth, right? Because on the one hand, there are some, with the WELL project and the Resist, Recycle, Regenerate program, there are definitely, the program was aimed at involving local youth from the neighborhood, so Chinatown, Flushing, other Chinatowns in the city, who might gravitate towards the program because of their experiences with housing precarity, right? And openly do talk about those connections. And then there are others who are students at NYU, right? And might have taken the course and then they learned about the work of CAB or C2U and then wanted to get involved, right? But I think overall, when we think of Asian American youth and sort of Asian diaspora when it comes to issues of displacement, it's something that's it's like diasporic politics, right? It's ingrained in migrant communities in ways that you don't have to have a visceral experience with housing precarity and eviction to want to come out to, like a rent strike or something like that. But it's an interesting group of young folks for sure. And, that's part of the work as well, where when we think about like part of this work focuses on Asian American politics, right? I think so much, me being trained as a political scientist, right? We know a lot about the Asian American electorate, the Asian American voter bloc. We don't know much about Asian American youth, right? And what gets them involved in politics or agitated. And that's such a central piece in the puzzle. And so that's part of, that's partially how I'm thinking about this piece of the work as well. Yeah.
I have maybe a very personal question, which is that the work, it's wonderful, by the way, it was really great to hear the talk. There's still an unsettling relationship in some ways to the kind of public works that you're unfolding in the university. And so I'm wondering, with WOW and other organizations that you've worked with, what is the ask and hope of your work within the university and beyond? And how are you navigating that?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think so much of it is based on experimentation and trust, right? And so in the most recent project that I talked about, the building the archive, that was a difficult one for me because I think being trained as a social scientist, we're only ever taught to extract from archives, right? But never really to grow and to build your own and to sustain it over time and to see it as sort of something that's living. And so that was sort of very much an experimentation in thinking about the archive as an embodied activist practice with communities. And it's part of it is also, some of this work exists outside of the university, and that's okay. And I think, I think over time I've come to terms with that, right? Just because the university is inherently extractive, right? And it's a piece that I'm still thinking about, right? What is the way to think about community collaborations in a way that feels good for me as a researcher, as someone who is committed to liberatory practice, but also to the communities in which I'm writing solidarity with. Those two are often very much in opposition of one another. But a lot of that is just, taking things day by day.
It's an interesting moment to be in that space when, I think those of us who claim to be abolitionists feel, what is that role in the academy? Because the academy has created duress for abolition. So it's a moment where, universities like Berkeley are creating endowed chairs in abolition studies.
Yeah.
Question mark.
Exactly. It's I really think about how we can think more expansively about academic and non-academic collaboration. I don't think that resource sharing and or just funneling resources is enough, right? I think materially, what is it that we're willing to give up? I think that's a question that, is a good place to start from. and to think about what is it, one, to do the kind of deep listening that I think a lot of social scientists are just not trained in, right? A kind of understanding that our communities have always been stewards of their own knowledge, of knowledge production, of dissemination. And yeah, and not needing to institutionalize everything.
Kind of picking up, I think, on some of the earlier questions, just noticing the photos of the two parts of the talk in a sense, right? The people that were populating these sort of sets of projects, right? But the latter part, a kind of visibly younger population, and I guess so. I'm wondering what is, if you could just sort of say more, how are these, is the first part around sort of this like sort of housing precarity, is this a sort of earlier moment, or are these two sort of the more abolitionist sort of future envisioning, is this happening simultaneously, or has that sort of come to the fore? So I guess one question is, are they simultaneously happening? And if so, the participants of these various, there's certainly some overlap, but are they seeing each other? Is there intergenerational, like what's the nature of the intergenerational dialogue or discussion? Are there moments where maybe movements, I could imagine that the folks that are sort of trying to address these immediate housing issues might perhaps feel concerned with attention being elsewhere, not the sort of, so how does that stuff play out? But I guess wondering if, what is the nature of the interface between these kinds of projects, or perhaps there isn't a lot of interface because one sort of maybe took place a little earlier than the other, and so they're not sort of overlapping at the same time.
Yeah, so I think beyond overlapping in the form of, just community collaborations on the ground, there is a difference in the work that the Chinatown Tenants Union does compared to the WOW project, in that the work that CTU does has been longstanding, right, since 2005. They've been persistent in thinking about and advocating for solutions within and beyond, right, the state. So thinking about, one, the limitations of litigation, bureaucracies of housing core and the limitations of that, but also needing to ensure those solutions in order for tenants to stay at home, but recognizing that it's very much temporary, right, and not for the long haul. Whereas the work the WOW project does has very much been influenced by the defund movement, right? Thinking about resource allocation. If we're going to be spending $15 billion on constructing 4 new jails and $100 million on NYPD, what is it that we can see instead for our communities, right? So thinking about expansively about resources and that kind of abundance. So there is an overlap in the sense that in timeline wise, right? But I think in terms of theorizing and thinking about the possibility of what might come, there is that connection. And we're seeing that unfold a little bit more, where CTU tenants are having conversations with their tenant membership base about the jail construction site, right? When the city has largely opposed the community-led rezoning plan because it would be too expensive or things like that. I think that's in direct opposition to what the city has decided to allocate the funds for, right? For the carceral expansion and for imprisoning more folks. So I think it's part of the catching up is just building that kind of mutual language, right, with tenants. And yeah, I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Could
used the word steward earlier, and noticed in the short film that the father called himself the steward of the space, while his in-laws were the owners, and then the daughter, I guess, is kind of doing something else. But I wonder, in the language of kind of reimagining and having different features and different ownership models to resist racial capitalism, wonder, as you talked earlier also about the complexities of language translation, interpretation, just to get everyone into a litigation space or a kind of communication space. What kind of complexities or challenges or successes have you seen where it's like the idea of getting everyone to get to a single language, but then you're trying to also create new language for a new future too? What's happening there in any good or bad way?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting piece, right? This like question of language and language justice in particular, and building across generations. And I'm just thinking about one of the conversations I was recently part of, bilingual conversation about abolition, that was part of the borough-based jail liberation plan in that store space. And it was led by youth organizers, and they presented a document of terms, right, that they had translated into Chinese, things like abolition or transformation or root causes, right? Terms that might seem really easy and sort of second nature to those who are already well-versed in abolitionist politics, but might be a little bit more difficult to translate and to navigate with the older generation, right? So like transformation is like revolution, and when it's translated into Chinese, and so when you're using those terms with elders, especially with tenants, like they have their minds transported to a whole nother time period, and that's not what you want, right? So it's working through those nuances that come through daily conversations and practices, right? And it's spaces like the storefront that create those moments. But it's also recognizing that a lot of our elders and folks who have been in community already have a way of talking about the exact same things that we're trying to get at, right? That things like abolition might not be so different from some of the practices that they already practice within their community. For instance, like community care, mutual aid, where there's so many different practices, especially during the pandemic, that a lot of that seniors do participate in, right? And so it's recognizing what's possible, but also what already exists within communities, and sort of building a language for describing those things.
We talked about this a little bit before, but a lot of your presentation focuses on the struggles of these organizers against these very powerful players like police, jails, landlords, etc. I'm curious a little bit more about like tensions and contradictions within like the Asian American community in New York in general, and like how much of the organizing work that these folks do also has to, I guess, struggle against like people who might be in the camp of like, anti-carceral or like carceral solutions, like anti-Asian hate and things like that. You mentioned a little bit about like, history of anti-Blackness in these communities, the Asian American Foundation, which takes a more carceral approach to these issues. So I'd love to hear more about like within Asian American community struggles.
Yeah, so gosh, I keep on like deleting those pages or adding them back in for this book. But I think one of the examples that come to my mind most frequently is so the tenants at 90 Elizabeth Street. They were organizing against James Fong. This was during the same time in 2016, in November, when Akai Gurley was murdered, right, in New York City, and he was shot by a Chinese cop, an NYPD officer. And that really blew up sort of the organizing of the Chinatown Tenants Union, because CAB as an organization took a very vocal stance against police brutality, given their history, right? And also given their coalitional alignments with different Black liberation movements in the city. And so there was a disjuncture between the stance that CAB took as an organization versus what a lot of tenants felt was did not represent, right, their view of whether or not they their view of the situation of the case. And so there was a lot of internal conversation, a lot of contention, a lot of negotiation, and some tenants ended up leaving the organization, right, as a result of conflict. And so CTU ended up having to basically build up a base again, right? I think tensions like this are really necessary for organizations in order to grow, but also to think about developing a liberatory language together, right? Because I think it was very much a learning movement for CAB as an organization, who took a stance without, by talking to the tenant membership base, but also for tenants who might experience carcerality in their lives very differently than someone like a Kai Gurley who was murdered, right, in public housing. But there are connections that can be made. And if those conversations are made, then I think a lot of the tenants, in one of the instances, I was thinking about one of the tenants who had been part of CTU for a long time, made connections between sort of like the kind of surveillance that he's experienced in his own home and the calling of the police by his landlord to what was happening in the pink houses where Kai Gurley was murdered, right? But it takes a lot of time and effort to get to those conversations and a lot of working through tension. But those moments are there, and I think that's just that is part of the work too.
A couple minutes left if there's any other comments or questions. Please join me in thanking Professor